This is a passage from the autobiography of one of our ancestors, and he writes right here on the front page, "The writing in this book is not for that anybody should read it, for there is nothing in it to attract. What there have happened to me in life is very much like what have happened to others. We've all seen something others may not have seen. The only object is to pass the time, and I am a hater of idleness. And the thing here is to wrote down clearly in my mind and memory." The writer. So you can learn a little bit about him from this, but one thing that I think he's trying to get across is that he doesn't want to make a big deal out of what he's done in his life, and he doesn't think it's too special. But I actually found it very special for us and very important. So you might sometimes wonder, why was I born as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or why was I born in the US? And the answer to both those questions involves the people that came before, and this is one of them that we'll be talking about today. He's one of many people who immigrated to the US, and he's one of several who also joined the Church of Jesus Christ. So Niels Christian Jensen, he was born in, let's see, well, first let me show you how we're related to him. He is the great-grandfather of my grandmother, Joyce Hunt, and so he's our fourth great-grandfather. He was born on December 8th, 1838, in the very top part of Denmark. It's an agricultural area, and his family was not wealthy. 5 years after his birth, his mother unexpectedly passed away, and his father probably didn't know what to do with the children. He had 2 siblings, so he gave them out to different people to take care of them. And Niels Christian recorded that after his mother died, he remembered going to a house where there were some young people and some old people. And after just 1 week, he heard that someone say, "We can't keep that boy. That boy does nothing but cry." So they shipped him over to another family, and he lived for a few years with the next family, an elderly brother and sister. The brother was a blacksmith and the sister was a weaver. A few years after that, he went to live with an elderly tanner. And then from there, he went to live with a young woman who had just gotten married. So it sounds like he was a foster child, just being moved around to different families in the same village. At one of these families, the one that was a weaver and a blacksmith, he learned how to read. And he learned how to read because the weaver, while she was weaving, she would point at different letters and help him learn to recognize the letters. And then he was sent to school. He paid close attention in school, and the teacher enlisted his help to help teach the other pupils. And one time, a priest visited the school, and the teacher told the priest, "I've been teaching for 36 years, but I've never seen one so easy to learn." The priest encouraged him to go to seminarium, which was like the university of those days. But Niels Christian knew that he had no one to pay for him, so he knew he'd have to work. And at 14, when school ended, he went to work, and he said life became more real when he suddenly had to care for himself. So at 14, he became a chore boy, and this meant he had to tend animals and help with different farming tasks. And his salary was $2 a year in 1920 US money, but he also got his room and board covered, and 1 pound of wool, 1 pair of wooden shoes, and all the yarn he needed to darn his stockings. And he worked with other boys, herding sheep and living in a house with some other 14-year-old boys. Maybe there were a few older ones. But one day while he was out tending the animals, a man on horseback rode up to him and said he wanted to hire him. And he told the man that he was willing to do it. And the man offered him $12 a year. So I think that was part of the reason he told him he'd do it. But after the man rode away, he realized that this would require him to leave his village, the place he'd lived his whole life. And he regretted giving the man his word, but didn't want to break it. So he left his town and the people he knew, and he went and worked with this landowner. And he said he was the best employer he ever had. And he would come out in the field and sit on the ditch bank smoking and watching the boys work. And he would tell them not to work too hard, work so that you can do something tomorrow. And he got into new hobbies while he was working for this man. He learned to ice skate and he saved money. And when he saved enough money, he fulfilled his childhood dream to join the Navy as about a 17 or 18-year-old. And he got to sail to England and he went on several voyages, and he wanted to become a captain in the Navy. I mean, he saw that could be a good career for him. But he actually quickly learned that the Navy, for some, didn't lead to great life choices. Sometimes I guess you can learn more from a bad example than from a good one. And in this case, there was a bad example that he learned a lot from. He said, "We had one man who in his talk with others made me see into it. He misused everything as soon as he had earned it. It made me think a good deal over this. I had thought to stay in the Navy, trying to make this my way of living. And there were decent sailors I knew too, but many took the wrong course. Could I resist and be able to stand against the temptations? I came to think I could find something else to do in life." So he saw these sailors gambling away their earnings and making poor life choices and thought, I don't think I want to be in this. So he went back to work on a farm. And at this time, Denmark was going through a lot of economic changes. The life expectancy, people lived to about age 40 or 50 on average. And more people were beginning to own land. But it was really hard if you were born without land to buy very much of it. And if you ever were sick and you didn't have a family to take care of you, there was very little backup plans that people had. And people spent almost 75% of their income on food. That's a really big difference from what we spend today. So while he was working for another landowner, when he was 21, the military came around and conscripted people. And he said, I knew I was going to be chosen, and I was chosen. And it just so happened that a war would soon break out. Denmark went to war with Prussia over some disputed territory in Schleswig-Holstein. And he was called up with the infantry troops and sent to war in Germany, well, in Prussia. And while there, he was captured and held as a prisoner of war in the Magdeburg Castle in Germany, and then returned after that, returned to his former life and was a carpenter and working as a Troy boy. And at this time, something happened that made him think more about religion. One of his coworkers that he respected a lot told him that he didn't believe the baptism of children was correct. And that idea really shook his world, because all children in Denmark were baptized the month after they were born. And so he said, I'll find an answer for this in the Bible. So he began to read the Bible in order to sort of find an answer for the baptism of children, but he couldn't resolve that question. And he thought more about religion at that time, but he was also trying to figure out how he could get ahead economically. And he realized that in Denmark, he really just wasn't going to have much of a future. And so he said, but I could not see any way to get anything. It seemed impossible to get a home of any kind. Prices were so high. So I thought there was nothing else for me to do but to immigrate to America. So he sold all his possessions, everything he owned, including extra clothing, anything he didn't need for his voyage. He packed a small suitcase and he bought a ticket to the United States. So imagine yourself coming to the United States aboard a ship. You don't speak English, so you can't understand what most people speak in this country. And you don't have a way to call home because there's no such thing as a telephone. You also don't have the internet or Google Translate. So this was a true adventure. He sailed to Canada, and then he traveled via railroad to Fort Lee, Minnesota. And he found some other Danish immigrants and began taking jobs, building railroad tracks, digging ditches, doing anything he could, trying to just earn enough for his room and board, living with various families. And he worked really hard and enjoyed his time in America. And after some time, he decided to go back to Denmark to see if he could persuade the girl he loved to come with him to America. Her family didn't want her to leave, but eventually he persuaded her to come with him. and Inger Marie and Niels Christian were married, and they came back to Fort Lee, Minnesota. And at this point, there's one thing that happened previously that I skipped, which was back when he was thinking about the baptism of children, he met a coworker, a woman who was working in the field with him, who said, well, this is how he explained the experience. He said, one day working in the harvest field, an old lady was working there also. She was a Mormon. I did not think much about the Mormons, and I talked about it accordingly. In her talk, she said, go and hear them. I said, I will not go very far to hear them. But she said, if there should be a meeting near around you, will you come? I said that I would. It did not take long before I had word from the old woman that there would be a Mormon meeting not far off. Then I regretted I had given my promise, but I did not fail to break it. So I got a couple of boys to come with me. He then describes how he and a couple of his friends showed up late after the meeting started, and there was no room in the meeting hall, so they had to stand in the doorway. But he was surprised as he was listening to this missionary preaching that everything seemed reasonable, and it wasn't at all what he had heard about the people called Mormons. And he worked longer on that farm, and he thought more about religion. And he said whenever he thought about religion, he said always it was the writings, talks, and singing of the Mormons. It just came to his mind, and he bought a Doctrine and Covenants and a hymn book, and said, I thought so much of their singing. And he would pray. He said he prayed the best he could to know if I could understand it. And he liked it. He liked what he was learning, but he also had a lot of opposition. Like the owner of the place he worked told him that it was a fraud, and he sort of worried that it was a fraud. And so he couldn't really bring himself to take action at the time. He said, I couldn't see it. But going back to now, his wife and he are living in Fort Lee, Minnesota. It just so happened at the previous general conference in Salt Lake City, a Danish-speaking elder was called to serve in Fort Lee, Minnesota, was called to serve in that area. And the missionary showed up and started having meetings with the Danish-speaking people, and they would all come together, and they weren't all that keen on talking about religion at first. So he would talk to them about valleys and mountains of the West, and they were pretty interested in that. And then he would switch to religion, and pretty soon they warmed up to the topic, and they came to meetings often. And on December 11th, the missionary had been working with a farmer outside of town, and he came in to Niels Christian and said, this farmer is getting baptized tonight, and I think you should too. And Niels Christian was in a lot of pain at the moment. His leg had to be elevated because he has a painful boil on his leg. And he told the missionary, I can't do it. I have this leg issue right now. And the missionary said, don't let the devil make you believe that. And when Niels Christian heard those words, he said they really hit him. And the missionary gave him time to think and left him alone. And as he was thinking, he realized, I'll actually say it in his words. He said, you have listened to the Mormons several years when they have set forth their doctrine. You have read several of their books, and you could not find any fault with it. You have thought that if truth were on the earth, they have it. So what is the reason you do not obey it? So he had this thought that I'm just going to do it. He decided to be baptized. He was nervous to tell his wife, and he went up to her and told her, I'm going to get baptized. And she said she would as well, which surprised him even more. So they went down and cracked the ice and were baptized. And his leg didn't bother him again until he was home. And once he was home again, he couldn't stand. He had to have it elevated immediately. He said about this miracle, about the baptism in the leg, he said, some may not believe me saying this, and if they did, they may have a way of explaining it. To me, it is enough for me to know positively that such it was. It is as true as anything can be, and I thank God for it. Had this leg made itself felt, I may it not have been able to go to the water that evening, and who can tell, I may it have been baptized to this day. Shortly after this experience, Inger Marie and Niels Christian decided to immigrate to Utah. Interestingly enough, before they joined the church, they never had any desire to live in Utah or immigrate, but he said they just felt a pull after their baptism. They felt a pull to gather, and they sold their home and their possessions once again, and they got aboard a train. and they rolled into Salt Lake City. And that's the story of how this child from Denmark, whose mother died when he was very young and was sort of raised by a bunch of people, was able to come to America and embrace a new faith and became our great, 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 great grandfather. And I want to just leave with this line, which has got me thinking, for we without them cannot be made perfect, neither can they without us be made perfect. I think a question for all of us to ask is, what did Niels Christian do for us? What are we doing for him? I think there's something that's happening on both sides of this equation, and I'm really thankful for the courageous people that sacrificed and lived uncomfortable lives to lead us to a situation where we can then do something for them as well. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I'll now pause the recording.